Hello everyone, in this video we'll be discussing joints. So joints, intersection of two bones. Now joints can be classified based on the range of mobility and the substances that connect two bones as Synarthrosis, Amphiarthrosis and Diarthrosis. Synarthrosis are fibrous joints. They have limited range of mobility. Example will be between the sutures of the skull. Next we have Amphiarthrosis, which have cartilage between them. So these are cartilaginous joints. Example of Amphiarthrosis would be the intervertebral discs. Next we have Diarthrosis, which is the main focus of today's video. So Diarthrosis are also known as synovial joints. So they are known as synovial joints because the material between the two bones is synovial fluid. So here we write synovial fluid. Now diarthrosis can further be classified into 6 types of joints. So let's discuss the 6 types of diarthrosis. So the first synovial joint is the ball and socket joint. Next we have the hinge joint. Next is the pivot joint. Next is the plane joint, which is also known as gliding joint. Next is the ellipsoid joint, also known as the condyloid joint. And finally, we have the saddle joint. Now the ball and socket joint. A ball and socket joint is a type of joint where we have a ball shaped structure which fits inside the socket of another bone. So the anatomy would look something like this. This is one bone. This rounded surface here is the ball part of the joint, and we have another bone that acts like a socket to this ball like surface. An example of the ball and socket joint is the shoulder joint. So here in the shoulder joint, the ball part would be humeral head and the socket is going to be the glenoid cavity of the scapula. It can adduct, abduct, flex, extend and circumduct. Now we move to the hinge joint. So a hinge joint is expected to open and close in one plane. So let's draw the hinge joint. So a hinge joint looks something like this. Hinge joint is expected to close as well as open in just one plane. An example of the hinge joint will be the elbow joint. The elbow joint is between the humerus and ulna. Next we have the pivot joint. So a pivot joint has a pivot from one bone and another bone that rotates around this pivot. So let's draw a pivot joint. Here I am drawing the atlantoaxial joint as the pivot joint. So what I have drawn here is the axis, which is the C2 vertebra, and now I am drawing the atlas on top. So here if I label them, this is the atlas C1, this is the axis C2, and this is the odontoid of the axis. So the atlas will rotate around the odontoid of the axis, thereby forming a pivot joint. So the motion will be rotation. Then next we have the plane or the gliding joint. So a plane or a gliding joint has two plane surfaces that move against one another. So I'll just draw a plane or a gliding joint. The joint that I'm drawing here is between the radius and the ulnar. So this distal radio-ulnar joint is called as a plane or a gliding joint. So this is the radius. This is the ulna. This is the distal radio-ulnar joint, which is a plane or a gliding joint. So example, the distal radio-ulnar joint. Now we move to the ellipsoid or the condyloid joint. So an ellipsoid or condyloid joint is a modified form of a ball and socket joint. So an ellipsoid or a condyloid joint is just like a ball and socket joint, except the fact that the socket is not deep enough to act like a socket. Rather, it is very shallow. We draw a convex surface and a slightly concave surface. Now a saddle joint is quite similar to an ellipsoid or a condyloid joint when it comes to mobility. So we'll discuss the ellipsoid and the saddle joint together. We'll draw a saddle joint. So a saddle joint looks similar to the saddle that's on a horse. So both ellipsoid joint and saddle joint have mobility in two planes, and these two planes are perpendicular to one another. So an example of an ellipsoid joint will be the radiocarpal joints. Radiocarpal joint is nothing but the wrist joint. Flex your wrist and extend your wrist. You can flex and extend your wrist very well. So that is one range of motion for the radiocarpal joints. Now next, perform radial and ulnar deviation. So radial and ulnar deviation is minimal. So it has two ranges of motion in two perpendicular planes. Now next we'll talk about the saddle joint. Example of the saddle joint, the first carpometacarpal joint. You can flex your thumb and you can extend your thumb. You can adduct your thumb and you can abduct your thumb. So this is the range of motion of the saddle joint. So one point that you need to note here is that both the ellipsoid and the saddle joint can also perform circumduction, but the ellipsoid joint has limited circumduction. This is an important point that you must keep in mind. Hope this video was helpful.